I brought a guest up here with me. So Brian Carr from Thumbmore is here with me because we want to talk a little bit about a case study, but it's going to be a practical example of what was done on another dimension of what you just heard about for the US Open. We'll go into a few of those details here, but first I wanted to kind of set the stage for what are we talking about for problems and needs in this space. When we talk about those temporary events, oftentimes what's going on is that they need temporary scale, right? They need a lot of extra stuff there. And there's not always the availability of that hardware available in the rental market, because depending on what else is going on for adjacent events, getting things shipped and forwarded to the right place at the right time. And when you have a lot of that dedicated hardware in place, oftentimes it's a fixed purpose. So all of a sudden when needs change of production, you can't adapt to those needs. So that's what we know that we've seen happening quite often, quite a lot at different events, and the US Open example is no difference to that. So when you typically look at these big events, what that problem looks like is a rack full of dedicated hardware, lots of messy cabling. Now that's not a real picture of US Open. I'll put that disclaimer. That's just an example of what looks like if you ask me to wire the rack. But eventually it basically becomes very expensive to ship to site, right? It occupies a lot of space for a single purpose need that maybe only is used on day one of an event sometimes. It gets noisy, unlike me, I'm nice and quiet. Power consuming, produces a lot of heat. So all the problems when you have a lot of extra hardware that's only doing one purpose, that's kind of the use case I wanted to present here that was meant to be addressed by looking at virtualization. So as we look at the use case here, I wanted to talk a little bit about the US Open example this year, and Brian's here to kind of tell a story about how they look to solve that problem for the need. And to me, the big argument, right, that was meant to be made is we don't want all that extra hardware. And that's what we know. People have been coming to us for a while at EVS, because there's a lot more than just the court production, a lot more than just the replay servers, the switchers, the cameras. There's a lot of other ancillary production that happens at these events, and ultimately, you can't afford to bring in all this extra hardware when you don't always know what that need will be before the event or during the event as needs change. So Brian, you want to go a little bit further through kind of this use case and talk about what you guys did with virtualization?
Sounds good. So this year at the US Open, our goal was basically to cut down on our physical footprint, because there are some real space limitations for those of you who've been there, The other thing is that the scale of the project that Wazi Digital, now Veritone, undertook was to consolidate all of the international broadcasters under one roof in terms of sharing media and network services. So for us, where we essentially, the USTA, presents us with challenges to say you need to service all of these individual clients, we would have to requisition hardware for each one of those clients. And it gets really challenging to plan for that when, again, like James said, you don't always know what's going to happen on site. So one of the main advantages was to switch to commodity hardware, switch to a VMware infrastructure, and it allowed us to sort of predict those needs as much as we could, but then react when they changed on site.
Yeah, so the acronyms that are at the top there are examples of a lot of the other tool sets that oftentimes are used at these events from an EVS perspective that are normally hardware units that are brought in. Right. And oftentimes that's a physical database.
I was going to say, so XT Access is a great example. That tool, we had 15 of them the year prior, and that was a 6-foot-tall rack just of one service. Databases, that was taking up 6 rack units. IP Director, I lost track of how many we had. IP Web, virtualizing that, really allowed us the flexibility to turn it on, turn it off when we needed to, and not have to take up space.
Yeah, because that's typically something you wouldn't have found in the rental market. That's
correct. Yeah, that's not something that's really accessible.
So tell me a little bit about what you put in to solve this problem.
Sure. So this is just commodity hardware. Powerful computers, but just super micro boxes. The picture on the right is really the key. Is one of the main advantages is the converged networking. And so, that was our entire network stack for roughly 50 VMs at the US Open. And, each of those 40 gig pink wires represents 6 different overlapping networks that we're bringing onto the box on one wire and then distributing to the machines within the host. So it's really a powerful tool for, we joke, we call it getting lost in the matrix. Like a lot of times on these shows, computer networking has really become the problem that we're trying to solve on site, and it's not like video, you can't just chase it down sometimes.
Yeah, so you would have had extra KVMs, extra workstations,
right.
Desktops, and a lot of, usually what I hear a lot is the configuration time on site. How long it took once a rental box came in to start to configure that and get that up to spec for what is needed for the application at that point.
And that's one of the main advantages. All of this was configured prior to our arrival in New York. in our office in Los Angeles. We actually came to the US Open directly from another event using the same hardware. We literally had machines configured for the older event, and then for the US Open, we turned off the one event, we turned on the other event, and we were up and running pretty much on day one.
Yeah, so we're highlighting a singular event here, but obviously this is not just a one-time thing that was done as a concept. This is a real working deployment that you roll out at many events throughout the year.
Yeah, we did this 5 times this year at events starting at Augusta, finishing at the US Open. And technically we did some of it during the postseason for baseball for Fox, but this was really the key implementation.
Yep. So you had a diagram here that kind of showed at least perspective, because obviously we heard a minute ago about the courtside production and cameras. We know there's typically a lot of the trailers doing other production. Yep. There's a different layer in which this connects and correlated to the workflow, right?
Absolutely. So the biggest thing that, virtualization is not new. I'm sure a lot of you know. Your enterprise is already using it. It's really bringing it to the parking lot or bringing it to the remote. The key is really the thinking of the box as less of a single purpose unit and more converging your infrastructure. So not just running EVS services on the same hardware, we can be running file transfer services like Signiant or Aspira. We can be running reshare servers that are going to make storage presented to other appliances on the network. It really can enable, you can do all of that with hardware. It just takes more space, time, all of the things you outlined.
More room for error.
Exactly.
Because you can't constrain it.
Exactly.
But in terms of the larger workflow at US Open here, I mean, obviously there's a lot of the actual rights holders and the producers on the
right.
one side of the diagram.
Right. So
where does this fit in the content flow?
Okay, so essentially we were on the international compound. So the 3 EVSs represented the purposed EVSs. Veritone's main mission there is to archive the tournament and do some highlight production. So that's really our ingest. That ties to our storage, which is just below. In the middle, those are the 6 ESX hosts that ran all of those virtual machines. Again, this is not new. This is something that's available, but it's really bringing it to this type of a project. And then on the left side is really all the customers, we'll call them, that were served by this need. So we deployed about 26 IP directors around the compound, and those IP directors were a combination of virtual machines, thin clients, and really it saved a lot of space, noise, power for everyone that was involved.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned it before as well, is that we have a product called IP Web that oftentimes you can't find that in the rental market. There's not enough demand for that to be something acquired, so it normally would have been a big barrier for you to get that and source it for an event.
That was actually what was one of the genesis of this. We could not find it in the rental market,
so you basically just turned it on as another instance in your installation.
Exactly. What I want to highlight, though, is one of the things this allows, a lot of these panel discussions are about remote production, and I think we're going to get there. But what this allows, or starts to allow, is remote portions of your production. So we actually had 4 operators in Denver clipping off on IP Director like they were sitting in front of it on their own machines. So while they're using their other applications, IP Director just became one of them through TeamViewer, back to New York, and yes, we could have done that with hardware, but by doing it with a virtual machine, we were able to have multiple people logged into the same box, looking at the same thing, so if there was an issue, we could react to that issue. If a machine got wonky, we could just spin it down, spin up another one. Like, it's just, it really enabled something that I don't feel like we would have gotten to with hardware.
Yeah. No, I think that's the real win that we hear coming out of a lot of this. So to summarize, what I want to kind of put the perspective on is how did this serve up the win for the event? And what you talked about a minute ago. So it saves space on the overall installation. It saved money on the shipping costs of what had to be brought in from disparate sites. We transitioned a lot of our licenses for our products to now allow it to be a more granular level at a licensing side, so that you didn't have to be sitting on a lot of old licenses that wouldn't be used after that event.
Right, you've been much more flexible with that.
Thank you. The zero file transfer failure was an interesting one you brought up, and can you speak to that point?
Sure. So I think that's not something we can promise at every event, but at Shinnecock Hills for US Open Golf, we did have a failure-free event, and I think a lot of that goes to moving the entire infrastructure to flash storage. And that's, again, something that you're not going to do in the rental market. You're not going to find that on a mobile unit. Is really allowing sort of the command and control to be centralized and have faster storage.
Right, and so you could spin up and spin down XD access instances for transcoding and movements, and that gave you a lot of flexibility in the utilization of the system.
Yep.
So you saved config time because you said you could have snapshots. You could either come in with an existing config without having to spend hours.
I think one of the main use cases for this will be mobile units that are on contract to one network, say, and they pick up events in middle. I've been on those shows where all of a sudden we have to re-IP the entire truck. The concept of being able to sort of turn off one event and turn on the other event is Again, you can do that with hardware, but no one's doing that. So it's much more flexible for us to, spin up and spin down virtual machines.
And you talked a little bit about the enterprise level of features, and that's something that we see more and more coming into the broadcast side of the industry. You want to kind of speak to those a little bit deeper?
Sure. So I think the converged networking is a huge key because our computer networking is getting more complicated on site all the time. Redundancy and resiliency, I think, is something that we take for granted in broadcast, but doesn't always actually pass the sniff test. And I think that this is the sort of infrastructure that we don't typically have on a remote, and now we can sort of bring that to bear. And the reason EVS is really the logical place that we started with this is sort of they're at every event, and they're sort of bedrock technology that makes the event tie together. So if we can make that platform more resilient, then we can make the show more resilient.
So one thing I wanted to kind of add, this is my commercial insert advertisement here, is that you guys obviously have a big, heavy back end, and that's the service you guys provide, and that's the added toolkits and stack. We know not everywhere is ready to go out and find their own computer, figure out how to put that together, do all the learning curve in step one. So from an EVS side, what we've also done is made a companion appliance. So if there's someone that wants to get into virtualization, they want to make it really easy to deploy, we've made our own little hypervisor appliance, a little one rack unit frame that can get you started. And that can give you a certain amount of capacity of virtualization, easy to deploy, and then as you need more power, you can stack those up and scale out that storage so that now you have the resiliency and the fabric that you guys talked about, that you guys engineer from a service side. This can bring it down to the average level event. So we're happy to demonstrate that out at our booth. That's being shown out there from a demo. Come learn more, ask questions. But we wanted to highlight the great success story of how virtualization is bringing real, tangible benefits.
Yeah.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.